Okay, I want to quickly explain the heater core of your vehicle. That right there is what a heater core looks like. In fact, that is a heater core out of this truck that I removed and replaced because it had a problem. The heater core is essentially a small radiator. If you look at the little tubes there that zigzag their way through, and again, you've got a mesh of fins, and on this end here, let me set this down so I can focus a little differently. There we go. You got two fittings there, one for one hose, one for another hose. So coolant from the engine goes in one hole, goes through this thing, loops around, well, you can count how many times it loops, and then comes back out and goes back to the motor again. And inside your car, under the dash somewhere, is a blower fan, little squirrel cage fan basically. And so you have your dial, rotary dial on the dash, or maybe you got a slider, or you got push button, you know, slow, fast, wide open, whatever. The fan blows air through these fins. This works exactly the same way as a hair dryer, right? The inside of your hair dryer has a little coil with an electric resistance heater in it, and you blow air over it, and guess what? Out the other end you get warm air. Same thing here. This thing gets hot from the engine coolant, and the blower motor blows over top of this thing, and when the air comes out the other side, it's warmed up. And then inside your dash, you've got a very complicated, it's a great big plastic box in there with a whole bunch of flaps, little doors, and so it diverts the air to wherever you want it to go. And maybe you've got a dual climate zone so that the driver can have their temperature and the passenger can have their own temperature. Then you've got a flapper that kind of deflects different amounts of heat from one side to the other, and then you can divert it to the dash, to the defrost setting so that your glass gets all of the heat, and that's what you want when you first start a vehicle in the winter, of course, because you got to thaw all that frost and ice off of there. And then maybe you got cold feet, so you divert it to the floor, or you do a blend where you've got different settings diverting air to different places, okay? But your original heat source comes from this. Keeping in mind that this thing is heated by the engine coolant, you don't get heat inside the car until this thing gets hot. And so this is a common misunderstanding, because there's people that are like, oh, it's cold inside, turn up the heater. So what do? They crank the fan. Well, all you're doing is blowing air over top of a cold heater core. You're inside the car, you're cold, now you're blowing air over top of something that's also cold, and the cold air comes out and blows on you. It doesn't work, right? So you have to be patient, and that's why people warm up their cars. And environmentalists hate that because they don't want to see a vehicle idling in the driveway. But I mean, in some cases it's not safe, because if you don't have any heat in this thing, you can't defrost your windshield. So idling your vehicle to get heat to thaw your window is just a necessary part of driving a car. It is what it is. But you're not going to make it heat up any faster by blowing cold air over it. In fact, you could make the case that by blowing air over it, it takes a little longer for this thing to heat up when the coolant finally starts to flow through it. The coolant flowing through this is determined again by the thermostat. The thermostat will open, first of all, it's closed. All the coolant stays inside the engine. Sometimes there's a second diverter valve that when you get to a certain temperature, it'll start to allow coolant to trickle through this thing. Sometimes it's waiting completely on the thermostat to open before this thing gets anything. So all the coolant stays in the motor, and it loops through the motor, and eventually it starts to get hot. Then the thermostat starts to open, and it'll divert some coolant through this thing and also start sending it through the rad to be cooled off, okay? But you can't make it work any faster. It's dependent completely on engine temperature. The fault with this one, have a look at that. I'm not sure what's going on. This thing was coming apart or something like that, but that is supposed to be an open, clean passageway like that. Looks like part of it's coming apart inside internally. So basically I wasn't getting heat, so it looks like coolant wasn't flowing through this thing. By the way, if you have a case, it's one of the symptoms of a failed thermostat. If your thermostat fails, it normally fails in the closed position. And thermostats actually have a small hole or a check valve in them, which allows a small amount of coolant to trickle through it even when it's in the closed position. And the reason for that is so that you don't have a massive pressure spike in a system. You know, picture this, your thermostat fails, it's slammed shut, all the coolant stays in the motor and circles inside the motor and never gets a chance to cool ever, and never gets a chance to flow out ever. And you could have a massive temperature spike on the engine, and meanwhile, you know, you got a radiator sitting there waiting to do its job and it can't. So thermostats, the round plate in the thermostat usually has a small hole or a little valve that allows a little trickle of coolant through it. But if you have a vehicle that, you know, you got no heat coming out of your vents, and your fan speed still works, okay, that's separate. That's an electric motor. If your fan doesn't change speeds, that's got nothing to do with this. You got an electric motor problem. But if your blower motor will change speeds but you don't get heat, and you might see that your temperature indicator shows that your engine's getting hot, you probably have a failed thermostat. Something else you can check is come out here and grab this hose. And so if your engine's warmed up, this thing should be impossible to touch, right? It's gonna sizzle on your fingertips. If you come out and this thing is like, I don't know, atmospheric temperature, and meanwhile your engine shows a hot reading, well, you know that there's no coolant going through here, which means that there's no coolant flowing through the system. And the only way that that can happen is if your thermostat's shut. So you have a failed thermostat. So there's some diagnostics for you. Okay, how does this thing get fed? Well, way back in, there's your brake booster, by the way, and your brake fluid reservoir. You've got two silver lines right there that come off of the intake manifold. And these things will be located in different places for every brand of vehicle. Most of the ones that I've seen actually come off the passenger side, but this one comes off the driver's side. It's all however they designed it. And then way back in there, hopefully you can see a couple of hose clamps. There's two hoses right here that go through the firewall of the vehicle, okay? In fact, those two hoses are connecting to these two holes right here, okay? This thing is basically, it's in a housing inside of the HVAC box, and you can see a fitting right here for a screw that holds it in place. And then those two hoses that go through the firewall actually have metal ends on them that fit right into here, and there's a rubber O-ring in here and in here to seal it so that it doesn't leak. So yeah, your coolant comes out of your engine through those silver hard pipes, and then it transitions to some flexible rubber hoses, and then it transitions back to some metal fittings that go into those holes, and then it loops through there and then goes back to the motor, and that's where your cabin heat comes from.